We're back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. There's a great piece in Mint Press entitled "New Release Finds CIA Used Black Americans as Drugs Experiment Guinea Pigs." By now, many will be familiar with Project MKUltra. For decades, the CIA conducted highly unethical experiments on humans in order to perfect brainwashing, mind control, and torture techniques. For insight into this, we turn to my next guest. He's a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. He's traveled extensively in the Middle East and Latin America, and his latest book is entitled "Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an Essay in 3 Parts." Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here, as always.
So the article continues. Perhaps the program's most notorious aspect was the administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs to targets, particularly LSD. These substances were brought to Langley's attention in 1948 by Richard Kuhn, one of the 1,600 Nazi scientists covertly spirited to the U.S. via Operation Paperclip following World War II. When MKUltra was formally established 5 years later, some individuals consulted directly on the project. Caleb Maupin, your thoughts on this reporting?
Well, MKUltra, which was a CIA program that involved experimenting with the use of drugs, particularly hallucinogens, and investigating mind control, hypnosis, and other methods of trying to manipulate people and gain control over people. It's a matter of public record. It is not. This is not conspiracy stuff. This is not, reptile people and space aliens. They conducted the Church Committee, the Congressional Church Committee. They conducted hearings before Congress, and all of this was brought into the public eye in the late 70s. And it was front page news in the New York Times, and it was front page news on many American publications. This is widely acknowledged to have gone on. What I find to be so disturbing is that if you bring this up to anybody nowadays, generally, especially people on the liberal wing of things, will just roll their eyes and say, well, that's a conspiracy theory. That sounds crazy. No, this is acknowledged by the government. The documents have been published. There have been lengthy books written about it. You can read The Poisoner in Chief that was recently published, an important book. You can also read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John D. Marks. A lot has been written about what has been revealed. Documents have been released. This happened. Now, this particular piece that we're talking about, it acknowledges a racial component to MKUltra, and the very unethical and immoral research the CIA was doing had a racist component to it. They were specifically testing the drugs on African Americans, and that's a particularly interesting aspect of this that hasn't been discussed before. But this is reality. I mean, this is not tinfoil hat stuff. I mean, Google MKUltra. This is fact.
And Kit Clarenberg is the author of this piece in Mint Press. And he writes, while in many studies the race or ethnicity of test subjects was not recorded, further investigation by the Ottawa academics, those were the ones that did this research, revealed Black Americans were significantly overrepresented in the recruitment sites from which test subjects were drawn. And then he also talks about how they were perceived. It was as though they weren't dealing with humans, they were dealing with animals.
Indeed. I mean, go and read the article for yourself and read the ugly details about how these CIA operatives were talking about the people that they were unethically dosing with drugs to see what their reactions would be. I mean, we can talk specifically about what was done.
Go ahead.
Project MKUltra, it had a component to it that was called Operation Midnight Climax. And what that was that they would, the CIA found some houses of prostitution in the San Francisco area. And they decided to have these prostitutes lure their clients to the house. And then when they got there, instead of, having sex with the prostitutes like they thought they were doing, these clients were then, strapped down to the beds and given LSD as CIA people observed what might happen. And the theory was that, that going and seeing a prostitute is not something people are generally proud of doing. So these people were very unlikely to go public with their stories, and that there were scores of people who were strapped down to beds and given LSD against their will and had all kinds of hallucinogenic experiences while strapped down to beds and observed by CIA operatives. Another thing that went on, apparently, was that the CIA, they wanted to see what the impact would be if you distributed LSD in an area, right? They were thinking about, a military operation. Say we wanted to, attack a certain area. What if we got everyone stoned out of their minds, in order to create chaos? Would that have a military impact? So we understand that also on the West Coast, they were going around and just dropping drugs into people's drinks in restaurants, randomly handing people drugs, dosing all kinds of people, and then they would study the impact on the block, the neighborhood. What happens if we give everyone in this neighborhood a bunch of drugs and they don't know it? Now, you can't imagine the psychological damage that could do to somebody, right? If you have no idea that someone has given you a hallucinogenic substance, right? You're just sitting in a restaurant and, you look away, and while you look away, someone drops some LSD into your coffee or your drink, and you take it, and then suddenly, you're starting to see things that aren't there, and you're hearing voices, and that can really, really damage a person, right? It's one thing when someone knowingly takes hallucinogens, right, and that they say, I'm going to take this, I know what I'm doing. But if somebody just randomly starts, hallucinating and having wild hallucinations, that can drive them over the edge. I mean, we've heard the stories about people that, jump off of buildings, when they're on hallucinogens, et cetera. So you can imagine how damaging those experiments were. A lot of cases, these were prisoners, who were being held in prison. And again, you can say, okay, well, they're prisoners. They broke the law or something. Well, maybe they're serving a 1-year sentence or a 2-year sentence. But if you're given a huge amount of hallucinogens, that can damage you for the rest of your life. That could be a life sentence of mental illness, of psychosis. So the unethical implications of this are very, very massive.
You mentioned dropping drugs into neighborhoods. Well, that sounds eerily reminiscent of the Gary Webb San Jose Mercury News story about crack cocaine and guns in neighborhoods, that unlocked train loads of weapons would appear in a neighborhood. And people try to make that Gary Webb story out to be conspiracy theory. I bring that up to show a pattern of behavior. There's a piece here, Dana Strauss, who led the Auto University investigation, was talking about the disproportionate representation of Black Americans in MKUltra experiments, although she's certain that if the agency's researchers did not have a readily available prison population at their disposal, they would still have opted to targeted people of color in the manner of the Tuskegee syphilis study. Again, pattern of behavior. Prisons were already filled with Black bodies. They could have experimented on free individuals, but they would not have been able to get away with these kinds of experiments. There were no protections at this time for vulnerable populations, such as incarcerated research participants. Again, pattern of behavior. Caleb Maupin.
Well, and one thing that's particularly reprehensible and just kind of, frustrating, I mean, it's just not just frustrating, I guess, it's sad when you read about this, is that the people who worked with the CIA on Project MKUltra and did all these unethical things, they weren't punished for it. They weren't made a pariah in their academic field for doing it. They rose to prominence. One psychologist who basically, he was just kind of an unknown psychology professor who was approached by the CIA to start working with these projects is Carl Rogers. And in the 1950s, Carl Rogers was involved in CIA research with LSD, mind control, hypnosis, et cetera. And they rewarded him. And by the mid-'60s and early '70s, he became probably the most famous American academic psychologist, right? They said, this is the guy who will do what we want. And they pulled some strings and they enabled him to become kind of he was given all kinds of awards by the American Psychological Association. He became he was just considered the American psychologist of the 1960s and 70s, Carl Rogers. And they rewarded him. I mean, they pulled some strings and they made him famous and rewarded him for his involvement in their operation. And that's particularly reprehensible. I mean, if you look at anything about ethics, if you look at anything about the way one should be conducting experiments, what Carl Rogers was involved with and what Project MKUltra was doing was not ethical and it was not moral, and he shouldn't have been rewarded for that. But that shows that these intelligence agencies have a lot of power, and they are able to maneuver things, and they're able to get some people's work highlighted and promoted in mainstream media, and they're able to arrange things for people, and that's often, the way these things are conducted. It's not like the CIA is sitting there, writing him a check. All right, do this for us, and you'll get a check that's signed CIA, and you'll take it to the bank. That's not how these things are done. People are rewarded, promoted, and encouraged in much more covert ways. But it's not just Carl Rogers. You can look at some other big names in academia, some big names in other fields, in the arts and all of that, and that a lot of them got their start with the CIA doing unethical things like this. And as a result of that, were rewarded and pushed forward to the front.
And so that people don't think that this ended in the 60s or ended in the 70s, CIA files confirm Guantanamo Bay torture program's MKUltra roots. The author of this piece, Kit Clarenberg, reveals the troubling links between the CIA's clandestine Guantanamo Bay torture program and MKUltra mind control experiments. And I think it's also important to realize that this was following on work by the Nazis. So as much as we love to hear and say the Nazis are horrible, they're horrible, they're horrible, yeah, that's true, but they didn't seem to be that horrible that the United States couldn't build on their programs.
Well, sure. And one of the most interesting things about this is if you read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is a book, one of the early books about Project MKUltra that was published in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. One thing that really spawned it was the fact that during the Korean War, a number of GIs, we're talking about 4,000 American soldiers who got captured and were prisoners of war in Chinese prisoners of war camps, confessed to committing war crimes against the Korean people, said the Korean War was wrong, and became sympathetic to communism. And the U.S. government was just horrified. How can this have happened? How can our good American boys, these patriotic young Americans from Iowa and Kansas and Chicago and Michigan, how can they have become communists? How can they be accusing their own government of crimes? And they figured the Chinese must have some kind of like magical voodoo or something. There must be some magical Asian voodoo that they're doing to convince these guys. Well, these guys knew what they had done. They knew about villages being destroyed. They knew about civilians being bombed. And yes, I mean the prisoner of war camps. There may have been influence. Obviously, if you're held captive, there's going to be someone's going to have control over what information you see and don't see. But the idea that there was some magical, mystical Asian voodoo that was being done or something to convince these guys that the Korean War was wrong. I mean, it's nothing short of ridiculous. And from there, we know British intelligence was also involved. William Sargent was a very prominent psychologist in Britain, and he was doing this kind of research in Britain and in Canada. And he later admitted, it was revealed that he killed people in the process of these experiments. There were people who were mentally ill, who were being held in mental hospitals that he kept asleep to see if he could manipulate their dreams or try to manipulate them, have them intake, information while they were sleeping. And several of them never came out of the sleep and died after he kept them asleep for about a year by injecting them with sleeping medicine and such. So, the horrors of what the CIA was doing here and the racial component, how the black community was really targeted. That's something that's very, very important, and people should go read this new article that was published.
And we've got just about 45 seconds. And as you were talking about the Chinese, it made me think about waterboarding and where we got waterboarding. And I just bring that up to say that it's not rare that we use tactics by our so-called enemies.
Indeed. Indeed.
Caleb Maupin, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.